Information warfare, is kind of part of this kind of molten vocabulary, isn't it? That we've kind of like been hearing about kind of so much. You've got information warfare, fake news, disinformation, misinformation, coordinated unauthentic behavior, online manipulation. Um, there is so much of this in the news all the time. The news is obsessed by fake news. And I, for one, am entirely confused and befuddled often by what any of these people actually really mean and what it's talking about, what's really happening here. Um, so what I thought I would do is kind of try and tell a bit of an origin story to make sense of all of this, to try and give you an argument for where kind of information warfare, fake news, and all these other overlapping concepts really come from. And in doing so, I think I will also try and give you an argument about like what they're like why they're occurring and what they actually do. That's what I'm going to try and do. So you're going to come on a journey with me a little bit, everyone, as we go back to the origins of fake news and information warfare, or an origin. And we'll go from there. And it's not going to be an origin that stretches back to the Second World War. It's not going to be an origin that stretches back millennia. I'm not going to take you all the way back to the way that the Romans did it or the Egyptians did it. I am a historian by training, but I won't actually go that far back because I'm going to argue quite a lot. This is actually quite new. So the origin I'm going to start at is 2003, and it's with cats. That, I think, is as good a place as any to begin our story about information warfare. So 2003 is the year that 4chan was born. Now, some of you might have heard of 4chan, some of you might not. It's become quite notorious in journalistic circles nowadays. So basically being one of the kind of fertile breeding grounds of the far and extreme right. But back in 2003, when Moot created 4chan as basically an image board, it really wasn't a breeding ground for the far right. It was a kind of home for lots of people across the world that basically were, I guess, viewed themselves as living mainly in online spaces. It was like a cultural laboratory of sorts, but it was a place of refuge and escape that people went to escape the offline world. They'd existed in other places before then, of course, but 4chan was a kind of magnet when it was created for all these people across the web to at that point begin to congress and gather. And in around 2003, all these people were watching with horror, as the rest of the world began to follow them onto their internet. Banks were getting on there, businesses were getting on there, normies were getting on there. All these people were getting onto their internet. And they felt like they needed to fight back. And if you were on the boards of 4chan back in 2003, there would have been a conversation that you would have seen, which went something like, they're all invading our world, the normies are invading the internet, so we're going to use the internet to invade the normal world. That's what we're going to do. And that is what they started to work out how to do. So these online communities began to kind of draw together this really heterogeneous literature to begin to work out how they were going to use the internet to counter-invade. Some of it was like dopamine studies. They were interested in working out how the brain worked. Some of it they were drawing out of a kind of parallel conversation which began in the militaries around memetics. Some of it, sometimes they were looking at social engineering. Sometimes they were looking at behavioral psychology. And they began to kind of draw together this kind of strange new literature or tradecraft, or none of those things really, but some kind of methodology for how they were going to use the internet to kind of begin to reach out. And they began to do things which people began to notice. So they went on to Oprah Winfrey's blog and they trawled it, and they said that they represented the largest paedophile network in the world, over 9,000 penises, all raping children. And Oprah Winfrey took this completely at face value, and at that point, the most watched show in the world went on, stared straight down the camera, and warned her countless viewers that she'd been contacted by the largest paedophile network in the world. It wasn't. This was an in-joke from Dragon Ball Z. It was an in-joke from one of their, it's over 9,000 power. It was nothing of the sort. But nowadays, we would call this media operations. This was about placing a story, and they did it brilliantly. Justin Bieber rather unwisely asked the internet where he should go on his tour. and 4chan answered that he should go to North Korea and rig the poll so that North Korea came top. Again, they would have called this for the lols. Right now, we would call this online manipulation. Time magazine, rather unwisely, asked the internet who was going to be Time Person of the Year. 4chan answered their creator, Moot. But then they also rigged the poll so that every other person was ordered to spell marble cake also the game, another 4chan in-joke. Again, they just thought this was incredibly funny. Nowadays, we would call this a piece of online manipulation. Habbo Hotel was an online game. I don't know if anyone's ever played this. I never played this, but it was an online game where you could hang out. Rumors went around the internet that this was racist, that the game was racist. And 4chan invaded the game. They blocked the entrances of the exits. They formed swastikas in the swimming pool in protest. They thought this was incredibly funny. We would now call this a swarm attack. They wrote manuals for how lots of people at different locations all over the world in a really decentralized way should all attack a central point at the same time. They call this, now this would be called swarm attack. And they began to basically game out social media platforms using sock puppets. So they would create hundreds and thousands of social media accounts, and they would get things to trend, and they would fake being audiences, and they would cause reputations to form or to break apart. And there would only be a small number of people all hanging out on 4chan, kind of laughing to each other about how the rest of the world thought there were thousands of people doing this, and in fact there were just a couple of them. And they began to write little pieces of software, little scripts to allow them to do that. Again, we would call this astroturfing. We call it sock puppetry. They just said this was for the lulz. They thought this was incredibly funny. So they didn't call this information warfare at this point. They wouldn't have called this fake news or misinformation or disinformation or any of the words we now have. They would have just said this was for the lulz. For them, this was simply an expression of power. It was a way for them to begin to do a little bit to the offline world, which they thought the offline world was doing to them. But they were sowing the seeds back then for something I think incredibly important. They were beginning to do what a lot of other people would then take up the mantle to do and do even more. And they celebrated each and every one of their victories with cats. Now, I don't know if you've all seen the cat memes, hacker cat, long cat, Nyan cat, ceiling cat is hacking, all the rest of them. Those cats are not a mistake. In the early days of 4chan, they wanted to work out how you can package an idea to make it spread more easily across the world. And when they were trawling through all the literature, they knew that a really powerful emotive reaction in someone is one of the reasons that you get someone to share. What causes someone to have a really powerful emotive reaction? A baby. What also causes someone to have an emotive reaction? A cat. Package an idea up in a cat, and it will spread around the world. That is what 4chan learned. And it is absolutely no accident that the internet is full of cats. Cats are immensely shareable, and 4chan worked out basically how to, and I'm going to use the word I won't use very often, but I'll use it once with apologies, to weaponize cats before many other people. So that's chapter 1, if you like, ladies and gentlemen. That's the first act in our short story. 4chan, I think, was there first, and I think they began to sow the seeds. But the next act is really a story of how lots of other people realized that they could do what 4chan was doing as well. And they weren't getting into this game anymore for the lulz. They were doing this instead for the money. So they realized that you could basically do the same kind of online manipulation and you can make money from it. This wasn't just a cultural thing. It wasn't just to hang out on the image boards. You could make serious money by doing this. And that's what happened next. So first, people began to work out those AstroTurf accounts, those fake accounts. Well, how do you make them? How do you make them? How do you sell them? How do you bottle them? They're now an asset. So let's create them like any other commodity. And this took me about 5 minutes to find on the darknet. Your huge mega bot pack. So this is a script where you can create your Google bots, your Facebook bots, your Twitter bots. You've got bots there for manipulating Craigslist, for Alibaba, for LinkedIn Messenger, iMacro scripting. Basically, this is the scripts. This is the whole pack of scripts that you use to begin to manipulate all these platforms, all for the princely sum of $3. So what's happening here is that people are beginning to write software in order to allow people to manipulate online spaces. And they're doing so, like any piece of software, they're competing for price and quality. So people are trying to get this as good as they possibly can do, as cheap as they possibly can do. And then all the dark markets that began to flourish in the dark net and actually in the light net as well. All this started to be bought, sold, swapped, renewed, modded, ad nauseam. Then you could then go on to websites to allow you to buy and sell huge amounts of social media accounts. So here's one of the such markets. It's in Russian. And what you see there on the left-hand side, rambler.ru, gmail.com, AOL.com, these are the floating rates to buy fake social media accounts. So for one, if you want your AOL.coms, they're in red. 1 to 10,000 is 150 per account. Gmail.com, 110,000, $380 per account. Could be more expensive. And my experience is they sell these things like bottles of wine. So you've got your like cheap plonks, the new accounts, all the way up to your aged, sophisticated vintages. The ones that have been there for years, that have been obfuscated, that Gmail has no idea is still existing on its platform. And there's like Gmail special like days where they say Gmail for less. I mean, it's like any other shop front. Only here, very easily with just the credit card details, you can go on and you can buy as many Twitter accounts or Gmail accounts as you could possibly wish. They're beginning, basically, in the interest of money, to scale up the things that 4chan was doing for free. And then when you've got all your accounts, you might buy something like this, and this lets you coordinate them all. So this is a piece of software where if they follow or tweet, you could basically script them all out. It's very, very easily, plug and play. You're being able to control your zombie social media account army, all from a desktop, and all for just a handful of dollars. And then you have your legend farms. These were it's social media accounts which were entirely manually led. Oxford University tracked one down in Poland. They were running 15 to 25,000 social media accounts, all of which were indistinguishable from a normal person. They all had their writing styles. They all had different languages. They all had linked social media accounts. There was absolutely no way that any online researchers, including us, could ever have distinguished these from the normal thing. The others were leaving breadcrumbs. We could find them. These were indistinguishable. And this is Bessar. This is a fake news merchant that I went over to Kosovo to meet and interview and hang out with the BBC a couple of years ago. And he was doing all of this for the money too. These weren't necessarily 4chan kind of online culture people anymore. These were young men, primarily, I think, in, say, the Balkans, who were just drawn to the immense amount of money they could make simply by harvesting all of our eyeballs. This didn't yet have a sharply political motive, is the point of Bessar. What he was doing in all of this was basically to harvest us much more easily than any poor journalist like Gavin ever could, because Gavin always had to tell the truth. And Bessar, in fact, didn't have to tell the truth at all. So he had this phone, it never stopped pinging, the notifications would be endless. I judge he could get his content in front of around 1 million eyeballs spread across maybe a dozen different massive Facebook groups. One was dedicated to pit bulls, one was dedicated to Native American affairs, one was, it seemed like it had something to do with very small places or very small objects. All of them are weird. All of them had massive audiences, and Bessar was using all of them to basically harvest clicks. And sometimes there would be fake news. So Jamal Khashoggi, do you remember the Washington Post columnist murdered by the Saudi Arabian regime? There was some outrightly fake news stuff like this. This one concluded suicide. It's not true that he was sharing, but most of it really, really wasn't. Most of it was a kind of clickbait, really. And if you're worried about the barriers to entry into this new world, if anyone here is considering a second career as a fake news merchant, here is a fake news starter pack. Which one of them showed me. So there were all these closed groups on Facebook too, where you could basically buy everything you needed in order to become a fake news merchant. You could buy the groups, you could buy the content, you could buy the ad monetization. Bessar used to earn €9 a day as a waiter in Pristina, Kosovo. And last time I spoke to him, he was earning about €250 a day as a fake news merchant. Is that a fortune? Is he going to be a millionaire by Western standards? No. Is he earning just an eye-watering amount for someone in Bessar's position in Pristina? Absolutely he is. He's earning more than you could ever imagine. And I've been in shops in Pristina where people have told me the only reason this shop exists, mobile phone shop, the only reason this shop exists is because of fake news. But we bought this from the proceeds of fake news. Again, it's not really fake news per se. It's more this kind of commercially oriented online manipulation, gaming methodology in order to harvest eyeballs. So that's Act 2. Act 1 is 4chan in my argument. Act 2 are these kind of profit-oriented figures who scaled it up. Now comes the militaries. Now Act 3, only in Act 3 can we begin to move towards something, I think, more recognizably known as information warfare. So, 2005, 2006, militaries around the world were all asking themselves the same question. It didn't matter whether they had come from liberal democracies or autocracies. Big militaries, the US, Russia, the UK, they're all basically asking themselves a question, which was, we now live in the information age. How do we, society's changing, the world is changing. How do we as militaries keep up? They all ask themselves the question around the same part. And all of them pretty much rewrote their own operational doctrine, which is this kind of really interesting document the militaries have, which is basically like a problem-solving guide for what it means to be a military. Britain created what they called integrated action. And they said, look, the point of military force or violence, of everything that we do is basically to change attitudes and behavior. That's the whole point of warfare. That's what we do as militaries. The Russians had a slightly more verbose construction of military force and information, economic measures, and so on. But largely they were kind of getting at the same thing. And what essentially militaries were doing was they were reconceptualizing, in my view, like what information and warfare really was. And this is why my argument that it's actually a new thing is coming from. So, information has always been a tool of warfare, for sure. It's always been something which is used within war. You look at faked letters, you look at the way in which military commanders during D-Day had inflatable tanks. It's manipulating an enemy's perception of you, of the battlefield, having a greater kind of perceptual envelope of what's happening and what people's intents and actions really are. That's always been an advantage in war. But that's not what was happening in 2005, 2006. I think what was happening is that they turned information on its head. So rather than being a tool of war, information was reconceptualized as being an arena of war, as being a theatre of war. It went from being something that happened within a war to being a space that war happened within. If that makes sense. And so you had air, sea, land, space, cyber, because that was already a theatre of war, and then information. It was another arena that militaries had to maneuver within and had to dominate in order to do their job as militaries. So you began to have this vocabulary of information maneuver, of mimetic weaponry, of information dominance. And that's really where that was coming from. And this idea that information was, was a theatre of war, actually a very hot one, that lots of conflict was happening within, and that they desperately, in order to serve their people, to serve their governments and their national interest, they needed to basically do this kind of really quite significant pivot to deal with this new theatre. And since then, really, what we've seen is the early stages of this great pivot in action. So information warfare, or rather the kind of like deliberate, orchestrated, organized manipulation of information online by states, has happened by Oxford University's reckoning in 48 countries. That was a few years ago. It'll be far more than that now. In most major elections, in almost every single major global conversation that you can imagine: climate change, female reproductive rights, obviously the US presidential elections, or by our reckoning at Chasm, all the way back down to the independence referendum. You can now see states were proactively trying to change the information that people saw. But far beyond actually major elections, into lots and lots and lots of different parts of our cultural and social kind of kind of attitudinal lives, as well as like sharp politics. What does this look like? Well, I've stuck on here a couple of, quite ugly screenshots from a piece of work that we did at Chasm with our colleagues at the Institute of Student Dialogue, pulling apart one of these government kind of information warfare campaigns. So you can see, I just want to show you like practically what they look like. So this is a Chinese Communist Party information warfare campaign that we're highly confident existed on Twitter. It's a network, about 700,000 accounts. Here are its attributes. So they, most of them were created in 2020, although some of them go way back, all the way to 2010 in terms of when we think they arrived. Here's the locations they mentioned around the world. We're using like geoparsing and like automated entity recognition here. So they're talking a lot about, obviously, they're talking a lot about China. They're talking a lot about Taiwan. There's some mentions there of Australia. There's the little patch in the UK, across the states as well. Really quite diverse in terms of its like geopolitical kind of like orientation or intent. What they're really targeting are replies, interestingly. So that's what that network is actually doing. Tweets, very small number of tweets, very small number of original messages. Some amplification, retweets. This is then copying other people's tweets and resharing them amongst the network. What they're really doing is they're jumping into the reply stream. So when a big announcement happens, this government network is basically getting in there and trying to fake a kind of organic reaction to whatever is happening, the cheers or the boos of a kind of digital gore or populace. That's what this network was really doing. And we can see there when we do network analysis, you can see the kinds of replies that they're kind of targeting. So there's one reply. This is all Raymond Serrato's work, by the way, certainly not my own, who did this, all these amazing visualizations here. And you can see what Ray's done is he's on this network analytics where you can see that kind of, you've got your Western media bubble up there, and you've got like some like, Dr. Tedros and WHO. You've got, this is kind of like mid 2020. So like the pandemic is like kind of picking up here. So you can see they're already orientating towards public health discussions online. You can see there's quite a lot of the kind of Chinese diaspora that they're targeting over there. And then a lot of kind of Chinese media there, that dense cluster down in the kind of south. That's just one, that's really just one network. I just pulled that apart because it's a really clear one. But there are dozens and dozens of these happening across not just Twitter, obviously, but lots of other platforms as well. Right. So that, in a way, is my story arc for you all. An origin of sorts in 2003 with online subcultures, going on to commercialization, going on to, lastly, I think military stepping in, and lastly turning this from the lulls to profit to geopolitics. How long do I have, Gavin? I've got more, but I'm conscious I've been talking for quite a long time.
It's just gone. Well, my clock watches is analog. It's just gone 7 o'clock. We can, if you want to go on a little bit. I'm sure people will be interested to go on a little bit more. But if you want to explain some of the implications, go a little deeper, Carvin, and go another 5-10 minutes if you're okay with that.
5-10 minutes, fine. All right, that's exactly what I was going to do. So, what does this all mean, everyone? What are the implications? Implication number one: this is not really fake news. You talk to, I interview people that do this. I try. I mean, it's basically trying to interview actually like kind of low-level members of state intelligence networks, so it can be quite difficult. But the one thing that they tell me is that, I'll quote you one. This is, Carl, we don't try and lie to people. We certainly don't use news to lie to people. That's not the way in which you get people to manipulate at all. So very little of this is to do with news. A lot more is to do with culture, a lot more to do with society, a lot more to do with identity. Much easier, he says, this person I interviewed, is to simply make one truth more visible than another. This is all about shining a spotlight. You can build an extremely distorted picture of the world simply by making some truths visible and other truths not visible. If you just drip feed the Daily Mail every day into the far right's newsfeed, they're going to be convinced that the world is a given way. Likewise, the Guardian, someone else's newsfeed, is going to be very, very different. And quite often, the way these networks operate isn't by faking as a news establishment. It isn't actually by directly lying. It's by creating mobilizations or groups online of identity or infiltrating ones which already exists. And they're basically manipulating the kind of information flow simply by sharing some stories and not sharing other stories. Now, that sounds very innocuous, doesn't it? Because that's what we all do. And the problem is that's exactly what these people are doing as well, but they are salaried employees of a foreign state influence service. That's the only difference. But the behavior actually can be very, very indistinguishable. It's very systematic. It's very concerted. And it really isn't to do with lying. So it's not even really disinformation. To quote one of these operatives again, it's much easier to manipulate you by telling you something you already believe about the world and making you angry about that and then shaping where that anger goes. Outrage, not lies, is one of the surest kind of ways of manipulating people. And much of the content, to be honest, when you really dive into these networks, they're not even truth claims. They're not even like claiming like A or B or C is either true or false. And they're not really engaging at the level of the way that people think. And they're engaging the way that people feel. This is about emotionality. This is about humor, sexiness, comedy, and most of all anger. And then directly massaging that anger in different ways. For militaries, this is all technically trivial. You know, set against the astounding achievements in a place like Bletchley Park, what's currently being done is child's play. It's really not difficult to do any of this. It really isn't. Like, this is for militaries that at the scales they work at, with the budgets that they have, manipulating online platforms is not even in your top 50 biggest problems that you've got to do today. Compared to, you know, the sum total budget of Russia Today, RT, you know, which is basically a black ops Russian SARS operation, is you know, two and a half fighter planes. It's not expensive and it's not difficult. And lastly, it's much easier to do than it is to defend against. So you know, we spend our days building detection methodologies and architectures to try and spot this stuff online. And that is a lot more difficult than doing it, let me tell you. But spotting the breadcrumbs, reliably doing so at scale, in ways which you can then, you know, verify or prove as you journalistically expose it or tell the platforms to take it down, is much more expensive and difficult than it is to rig these accounts in the first place and just begin to do it. So at the moment, the reason we're seeing so much of this happening, I think, and who knows what of it's effect and what of it isn't, that's actually a very hard question to answer. But the reason I think it exists, despite us not being able to tell that, is that it is just so cheap and easy to do. Final point. Perhaps all military confrontations at some point need to be de-escalated. And I do wonder when that's going to happen here. Because we are seeing a very large amount of this. It really is like a state of war. There's absolutely no kind of legal kind of deterrence architecture yet. Like NATO doesn't have an information or mutual defense pact. There's no kind of understanding within the UN Security Council about how to deal with any of this. There's really very little in the way of like policy or law to prevent any states doing this. The only thing that really exists is a modicum of embarrassment if you're caught. And that means that there is very little by the way of like de-escalatory pressure. Like we don't really have, you know, everyone's like rushing forwards in like militarizing information spaces, and there's not a huge amount of thinking or incentive really in working out how you demilitarize them or you even call a ceasefire. Which if you're a kind of journalist or a writer like me, and I'm sure all of you, people that kind of hopefully like value information for information's sake and don't just see it as like a strategy or a piece of terrain to capture or basically something which only has ulterior motive. And that is what information is here, everyone. Its only value is in the effect that it creates. To go back to integrated action, to achieve behavioral attitudinal effects. That is what information is being deployed and shaped to do here. And that to me is a great shame because information, obviously, to me, has an enormous amount of inherent value. And my great fear really is that as information warfare picks up, and we are really only in the foothills of it so far, I see the kind of inherent value of information and I trust in it only then being kind of progressively degraded.
Thanks, Carl. That's brilliant. That's a lot to get your head around. I'm sure we've got a few questions there as well. If I may be cheeky just 1 second and kick off with one question. You mentioned that there's no de-escalation mechanism in place. Is there, there's no kind of NATO enforced, there's no kind of Geneva Convention of Information Warfare. Is there any suggestion that might be coming on nation states or organizations having this kind of conversation yet, or is it just so far not happening yet?
I think nation states are at the point where they're recognizing that the two main ways in which they've tried to deal with this aren't working. So the two main ways have been digital literacy training and pressuring the platforms. And neither of them is really sorting out because digital literacy, frankly, just doesn't work when you're dealing with like a tradecraft from an intelligence agency. You can't train kids how to spot this stuff. Like it's predicated on the idea that this is self-evidently and obviously recognizable, and it really isn't. Like we spend all of our day in, day out doing this, and we can't spot it out the time. So that doesn't work, and it's not going to reach everyone, and it's going to be an entire generation. So there's that, and then the other one is they basically try to like lob the hand grenade into Facebook's tent and the others, and say this is your problem. The problem there is that those tech giants are very clever, and they're very rich. And they have built defensive apparatuses to try and deal with this. We've worked with them. The problem is that they are, in a strange, from geopolitical terms, extremely weak because they're just companies. So what's the worst that they can do to a Russian FSB campaign? They can take the accounts down. That's all Russia. That's all that Facebook could do to Russia or China or any of the autocrats. And account takedown is basically an occupational hazard. You just price that into the campaign that you're doing. That's not really levying genuine costs or risks. So I think states are beginning to talk about, at least in the conversations I'm in, they're beginning to talk about, well, what about economic sanctions? What about diplomatic sanctions? What about direct cyber offensive operations ultimately? If they, I come from a liberal think tank, so it's a very strange position to be in where you spent years basically arguing for more state power. That's not typically what you do from a think tank. But, for years I've been saying if a state is going to concertedly try and undermine the integrity of our election, then we absolutely need the military and GCHQ to be involved in that. Absolutely we do. Like they need to be like hitting those servers and like kind of making it just riskier and more difficult for these people to do that. But at the moment, I think there's very little evidence that's really occurring.
Also, I think there's a question here. States need to accept there's a question of legitimacy, isn't there? States won't accept the fact their elections have been influenced or tainted because it kind of questions the legitimacy of their democratic process. So they don't want to be seen to admit there's a potential problem there.
There's that, and the other side of the legitimacy question is no one's written the rules of engagement for information warfare. So I've been in events both sides of the Atlantic with liberal democratic like kind of military commanders who are very, they'll show all these slides basically saying information theatre is the theatre where conflict is now happening. It's far hotter than any of the conventional military areas that the militaries have been obviously spent untold treasure to dominate and to compete within. And they're just sat there extremely frustrated because they don't know what the permissive conditions are for them to do anything. And obviously we have in the West, rightly, very rightly, created really strong and clear rules around militaries mucking around in our free press. Like we don't tolerate that. It's completely unacceptable. And that's what they see they would have to be doing if they were to like engage in a weird way, Russia or China in this new environment. So they don't. I don't think they know what they can do.
I'm just conscious of I'm hogging the airtime. Does anybody else have any questions here? If you'd like to just unmute yourself and maybe step up one at a time if there's somebody else.
Just observation, if I may, Gary.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Carl. It's fascinating. This is an area I was obliquely connected with back in the early 2000s. We're used to use a slightly oxymoron term, defensive information warfare. How contradictory is that? Because we were on the receiving, well, the theory was we would be on the receiving end of it. Your initial analysis mirrors almost exactly our protagonist modeling setup we had. And again, protagonist, that's a bad use of a word as well. But that's an aside. This is very much, we used to look at it as very much a substitute for kinetic warfare. And it was very much asymmetric, which I think came through in your latter part, particularly with regard to costs. The cost required to launch an attack using this kind of technology is fractional compared to what we were looking at, the skills required back in the early 2000s. So that has frighteningly changed. So there's an observation. It's become even more asymmetric in terms of the efficiency with which, let's say, an aggressive nation state can launch an attack. So content really has taken over rather than the physical effects of, let's say, bringing down a supervisory network or something, a control and data network, that sort of thing. We used to worry about bringing down the power systems and that sort of thing. That seems to have shrunk away a little bit. And it's more about manipulation of people's minds, which is a much more nuanced subject.
Thanks, Peter. And that's really nice to hear around having some validation for that narrative. I've never actually had that validated before in the protagonist modeling, so I really appreciate that. Thank you. But yeah, I think you're right. I think I in some ways, like, for all the reasons we've all spoken about, like the information sphere, quite different from like, cyberkinetic operations, has kind of gone slightly under the radar by a lot of our defense planners. I think everyone over the last like 3 or 4 years, I appreciate it. There's been a line of thinking in government and the military for quite a long time, but I think like it's the last 3 or 4 years, it's really hit the mainstream in terms of being a kind of major national problem. I think it really has caught everyone by surprise. And my kind of fear is that we've got kind of 2 options really, haven't we? We've either got the option of like engaging in information warfare ourselves, whatever that looks like, or we've got the option of, which I think is a preferable one, of like basically engaging in asymmetric warfare ourselves. And that will be, but basically like kind of countering information operations with other things. Like basically, you just tell Russia, look, if you're going to do this, then it's just going to cost you. I mean, the more you do it, the more the cost will increase. It's simple as that. And that goes for every NATO member state. My fear is that it does take quite a long time for us to kind of drag together the kind of international, legal, bureaucratic, and diplomatic architecture to make that happen. I think that the ball is rolling now, but I do hope that we don't have too many. Yeah, as Gavin kind of said, now this has become such a kind of massive kind of area of press interest. It's almost like the integrity of every election's being questioned, whether there is effective information operations present or not, which is a whole other different issue. And you do worry that this is just draining trust out of our entire system in the meantime before we can get the system up and running.
Yes, I wonder if we'll ever achieve the sort of position of mutually assured destruction in the information space. Think of some kind of nuclear type standoff where we've got some sort of weird stability surrounding this.
I do think that strategic symmetry of that and that kind of dynamic is actually the only thing that's going to prevent this happening. Is where we can respond, we can identify and respond as readily as they can attack in a way that just equals out the costs. From a strictly deterrence theoretic perspective, I think that's the only thing that we can hope for.
We've got a question here. Jason Hopkins has put one out there. We obviously, if I can just contextualize it, obviously you horribly picked on the China People's Party of China there. I'm sure they're knocking on your door later or bugging your phone. But what about our own government? Is it using any of these taxes to influence our population, or in opinions or ways we don't even know about? We know, and I've seen Facebook has been pretty blatant about, I mean, they put themselves out there. You can use us to influence elections. They have a department, and sections we can do this. Are we seeing our own government using similar tactics in our country or in other countries? Do we know?
Good question, Jason. So I wrote an article for Wired probably about a year and a half ago on a military formation that I visited called the 77th Brigade, which is essentially a kind of information operations battalion, I believe, strength of the British military. I do not believe at all that the British military would feel legally entitled to use any of the capability they might be building against British citizens. I think that the kind of cost, like the kind of legal costs of doing so, are just simply too great. The scandal and embarrassment would be too great. And if they do so, it would be an illegal operation of sorts, if you see what I mean. But I don't think that means that the information operations are not happening elsewhere in the world. And I would be really surprised if British military, the US intelligence community, and the Five Eyes in general aren't doing this, trying to just, boost pro-democracy conversations in Russia, or, to try and convince Argentina there's no point invading the Falklands again, or things like that. I'm sure that there must be information operations that certainly mirror and shadow all of our force deployments around the world. Sure. You kind of would hope them to be so, but no, I don't know. No one knows. I'm not from the intelligence community. I'm not from the military. I'm never going to know ultimately what our state is doing. I would eat my hat if a liberal democracy like the UK is wantonly deploying this against British citizens. So,
okay. So we have another question out there. Somebody else want to step up with a question?
lots in the chat here. So,
Yeah, I Rick Chandler here. I just posted one actually about the the government issues currently with Facebook, Google, etc. in terms of taxes and all the rest of it, and the awareness of this problem. It's not a big deal for them to work with the operators, the network operators, etc. And enforce strong authentication. I.e., you don't, unless you strongly authenticate onto the account. Overcome so many other social problems, or whatever, age verification and whatever. I don't think. You haven't mentioned AI tools. I'm aware of quite a lot of the stuff going on in terms of AI validation. I've been involved, funnily enough, in the COVID passport stuff with NHS and whatever, and there are huge issues around that. Unless we authenticate every user and every identity, then this will go on and get worse. I just wonder if you've seen anything happening in that way.
The anonymity around TCP/IP in the early internet is in my view one of the reasons why there's so much hate and nonsense that pours online. I do tend to agree that the unaccountability of anonymous online presences is a really important part of this. However, there's a significant counter argument to that, which is important to bear in mind as well, which is that the online world has always been one where people don't have to necessarily be who they are offline. That they can create gaming persona or entirely new presences. That's always been a really, really important part of online culture. And in parts of the world that say are not free, or where you can't love who you want to love, or you can't be who you want to be, still being anonymous online is not just a question of good or bad. It's a question of life or death.
I'm old enough to remember netiquette, and you got mail bombed if you did the wrong thing. So anyway,
yeah. So and doxing, the exposure of people that can be a really poisonous and dangerous tactic as well, where people's lives are kind of ruined for all kinds of reasons, which some people might think legitimate and others not. Sometimes I think actually too frivolous, if I'm perfectly honest with you. But yeah, if you're a pro-democracy activist in Syria or Russia, saying you need to strongly authenticate your Facebook account that serial Russia might hack is a really, that's a different prospect for me, right, than doing so in the West. So I've always been a bit torn on this one. I've always I've always kind of in a weird way thought this might actually be the first actual meaningful use of blockchain. Because there are really exciting applications there where you can actually create pseudonymous entities, which only under certain really clear conditions could be exposed. So you basically store your identity in a smart contract. I really like that pseudonymity because that seems to kind of begin to balance the need for ultimate accountability if you break the law or you're anti-Semitic or something online with not necessarily having to go around being called Carl Miller or Rick Chandler or Gavin Clark if you really don't want to.
Scalability might be a problem there, but I agree. But
that's that brings us into the raging crypto debates, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. And have you seen any AI? I mean, I asked the question. Have you seen any AI? I mean, we've got much more power on the networks these days. Quantum stuff coming online. Even what's it say? 60% of the UK of the world's DNA checks are now being done around the Cambridge Blue network and things like that. We've got a huge amount of power. Have we actually started to apply some of that?
Is AI in terms of what, Rick? In terms
looking for patterns, looking for why the attacks and the malevolent use of the accounts is fitting any patterns and whatever, monitoring them.
Yeah,
I've seen attacks in corporate infrastructure being handled by AI now. I just wonder whether it's happening on the outside enterprises.
Yeah, there is, and that's exactly what my research group does. So literally, most of us are natural language processing kind of research technologists that basically work on machine learning around exactly that, like spotting the breadcrumbs that all of these campaigns might spread online, doing what they do, and trying to turn those into detections. In doing so, what we're actually really doing is trying to replicate the same machinery that platforms have built, but outside the platform, so that we can do other things with it, like feed it into civic society or political pressure or state action or whatever. So there is the issue is that it's a arms race, as many of these things are.
Yeah.
Where as soon as you build detections, new obfuscations are then spun up on the other side. Sometimes we think we're winning, sometimes we think we're losing, to be honest. I say that we're pretty good at spotting reasonably naive or kind of old-fashioned attempts at doing information operations. But I mean, against the scale of the military, I really don't think that us or even the tech giants are going to be able to win this battle in the long run. Militaries are just a kind of order of magnitude bigger than bigger than what most of us ever could be. And these guys work on decades kind of scales in terms of building capability, which I don't even really think Google or Facebook really necessarily think at that kind of scale at the moment. So. Yeah, I'm not massively optimistic, to be honest, about us just winning this in terms of detections. It is a really important part of the puzzle, though.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? I think they're Colin also. I'm just keeping an eye on something. Well, just under 5 minutes left. Do senior politicians understand the general threat discussed here? We talked here about the unwillingness of states to dig too deep because they challenge the legitimacy of the electoral process. But that's kind of the public-facing perception of politicians. That's the public message they're putting out there. But do you sense that senior politicians, away from the public, behind closed doors, do understand this general threat that you're discussing here? Or are they naive or in denial or never heard of it?
I don't know. Yeah, it's difficult to characterize, isn't it? I can't tell you the number of talks I've done on this to politicians. I mean, nowadays, obviously not in the flesh, but for years and years. I mean, we think tankers like me were going in and doing presentations on this all the time. This isn't as a threat. This isn't particularly new. We were writing demos papers on this in 2015, 2014. Much more important though than us in the think tank world is the civil service. And I definitely think that machinery has recognized this as being a threat. So I definitely think that within the kind of senior levels of our national security community, the idea that state action is manipulating information in a way that might undermine the integrity of elections or other things in important processes to the UK is definitely recognised. I think that I think there's two big question marks. One is what does this actually do? I've been asked this several times by like senior civil servants. They're like, "All right, you've spotted this Russian network. Like, so like, what's its actual influence? Like, can we measure what this actually does in terms of behavioural change, or how much damage does it cause?" And the answer is like, I've never managed to think up a kind of a research method for doing that. If I'm honest with you, it's very difficult. Like the measuring influence and impact of anything online is like the holy grail. And if I could do it, I'd be doing that for advertising, be sitting on my island in the Bahamas. You know, I wouldn't be doing it for information. I'll probably be doing it for information warfare, but you know what I mean. It's very hard. And if you can't measure impact in the civil service and in government, it's very hard to get budgets. It's very hard to kind of, you know, get scaled big political will around an issue. And the other reason, again, is it goes back to this issue, kind of the same one for militaries, which is that I genuinely don't think government really knows what levers it can pull here. So, you know, they're funding digital literacy, they're fund fact checkers, you know, they're funding and increasingly supporting an ecosystem of society to help, but they can't interfere in the press or in what information is flowing around Facebook or YouTube any more than a military can, really. And because I don't think they necessarily know what to do in terms of direct action. Like policy and law, they will shift a bit, I think, in the next couple of years, and they would have, I think, if COVID hadn't happened. Like this was going to be the year of digital regulation. 2020 was going to be. But yeah, in terms of other things, yeah, they recognise it, but I don't think they know what to do. Is my short answer.
We've got one final question, I think, from Michael, kind of following on to that. If you can't measure the impact, can you measure the intentions of these campaigns? I just want to, you mentioned that Chinese campaign, for example, the Chinese Communist Party, and they were retweeting. They were showing, what were they retweeting? Was it conspiracy theory stuff? No, it wasn't the China. It wasn't Wuhan where this thing came from, or you know, what were they trying to do there? And so, and what can you measure intentions of campaigns, if not impacts?
Yeah. All right, let me not take the Chinese campaign. Let me take another one, because this is quite a kind of salutary lesson or example. So the first Facebook campaign taken down by Facebook because it was a state actor targeting the UK. This was 2019, I think. So pretty late in the day, but it was one that was deliberately spun up to target the UK. Now, when you check, so it was Facebook groups and pages. That's what this network was comprised of. And when you looked at what they had created, it was very odd initially. It was squatting on both ends of the political spectrum. So there was loads of fake far right groups, and there was also loads of like anti-racists getting really angry at the far right that were getting really angry at the anti-racists. And they were kind of like lobbing grenades at each other. But more importantly, getting both sides of, I don't like to say sides because the far right's way off, but you know what I mean. Like they were getting like kind of oppositional elements in a political dispute to become much angrier with each other. And that was like, that to me, like was extremely telling when it comes to the strategic intention, because the intention wasn't to make idea A or B more widely believed by the UK. Maybe that is sometimes what they do, and I think around like COVID in China, I think that is what they do. I think sometimes it is drowning kind of hostile voices and harassment and criticism and stuff. But here, the idea was, I think, genuinely to further polarization. So it's to find a wedge issue, find something that we're already really angry with each other about, and just like pour gasoline on both sides of it and just keep going. And I think this, like strategically rather than tactically, I think the aim is you do enough wedge issues, you exploit the already extant ability of online spaces to make us angry and to divide societies, and over time you'll like begin to like tectonically transform an open society like the UK's that values information and public debate make it more polarized, make it angrier, and eventually probably just less effective as an opponent, less effective as a NATO member, and probably less effective as a kind of geopolitical adversary. Like that's me inferring. All I can tell you is what the network did, but that was my kind of take, if you will, on what the intention was.
Okay. Great. I think that's we're up on the hour, I'm afraid, everyone. I think that's it. I just want to thank everyone. I'd like to thank Carl in particular. Obviously, I'm going to just put it out. Obviously, Carl very busy. I think we should give a virtual clap. Do check out his book and get a chance. Definitely.
Thank you, everyone. It's really nice to talk to you.
It's brilliant. And Carl, you've got any people you were coming out, anything you're looking at in the moment, apart from the whole rat's nest of this kind of information warfare? Anything specific you're looking at the moment?
Well, so yeah, I've got there's a podcast I can't talk about, which is very scary, and it's all going to come out. It's with the BBC in September. But I wrote a book called Death of the Gods. If anyone's interested in reading more about information warfare, it's a bit old now. It's 2018, and to be honest, I presented quite a lot of the information warfare chapter to you. So it's not a must read, but it does talk quite a lot about this if anyone's interested.
Sure. Well, thanks, Carl. It's been a pleasure having you here. Hope we get to meet again in person one day. And
yeah, so do I, Gavin. Thanks very much, everyone. A real pleasure. Thanks for all the brilliant questions. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight.
Well.
Cheers.